Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm really excited to be joined today by Farah Nazrali and Yogacharini Maitreyi. I'm Ross McKeachie, your host for Arkaya's podcast and YouTube channel. And today we're going to be speaking about nonviolence and also nonviolent communication. Farah Nazrali, BA, MA, has been teaching workshops, trainings, and retreats for over 12 years and masterfully weaves together Eastern wisdom teachings with Western skills and science to create experiences that blend the best of yoga and Buddhism with conflict and communication skills. Farah Nazrali, BA, MA, has been teaching workshops, trainings, and retreats for over 12 years and masterfully weaves together Eastern wisdom teachings with Western skills and science to create experiences that blend the best of yoga and Buddhism with conflict and communication skills. She brings a wealth of knowledge and stories from her studies in Tibetan Buddhism, lineage-based yoga, conflict resolution, nonviolent communication, and trauma-informed practices. Her website is farahnazrali.com. Yogacharini Maitreyi is an international trainer and the founder of Arkaya Foundation, a nonprofit registered both in India and Canada. She's a revered acharya or life guide and master teacher who has been steeped in the sacred traditions of yoga and tantra since childhood in South India. She's been teaching for close to 30 years, has over 100 published articles, and has trained over 80 corporations in enlightened leadership, stress, and self-management. Maitreyi facilitates a variety of online programs through the Arkaya School, including the 500-hour embodied expansion certification, which is much more than a yoga teacher training, as well as the weekly drop-in community class and satsang it welcomes everybody every Saturday morning from 9 to 11 a.m. online. So a warm welcome to both Yogacharini Maitreyi and Farah Nazrali.
Thank you.
Thanks, Russ.
Great to be here with both of you. And this is a fascinating topic, nonviolence, which goes, I think, a lot deeper than most people would think from just the surface. I thought a great starting point, since you're both yoga practitioners, yoga teachers, would be Ahimsa, the first Yama in Patanjali's Ashtanga Yoga, or eight limbs of yoga. I was wondering if both of you could just share a little bit about what Ahimsa means to you and how it has shaped your contemplative practice and the way that you show up in the world. And since Farah is our special guest, I'll ask her to go first.
Big question, I think, and I'm so grateful to be here and zooming in from the beautiful territories of the Snuneymuxw Nation. I'm um, I was exposed to um, the truth of Ahimsa when I met my guru and began to learn about how foundational non-harm is to the practice of asana and to the holistic practice of yoga. And in the first while that I met my guru Paramhans Swami Maheshwarananda, I don't think that I had ever really had full awareness of the ways in which my thoughts and my words and the things that I take in through the sense organs, how much it really was um, rooted in harm, in subtle ways of harm. And when I began to practice yoga, not only did it change so many things about my entire life, my being, my thoughts and mind, my behavior, my ways of communication, but I also really started to see how acceptable violence is in our world, in our media, in our songs, in our ways of speaking, in our comedy, in our entertainment. And and that was really shocking to start to see the ways in which our culture is so deeply rooted in violence. And we have entertainment that's based on harming other people. And we see images in the media of things that are played over and over again, and the damage that can do to our psyche. So since that time, which was many years ago, I think committing to ahimsa and understanding that our purpose as human beings is to love and serve all of creation and all of the planet, then it really sets you on a different path. And really, it's a lifelong, for me personally, it's a lifelong commitment to bringing that ethos and that consciousness into how I live my life, into my relationships, into my actions and behaviors. And it's an ongoing, lifelong process.
Thank you. Yeah,
Thank you.
Maitreyi.
That was beautifully said. It is a continuous process, an ongoing process of self-refinement. And the beauty of the Yoga Sutras and the Ashtanga Yoga system. Now, Ashtanga means 8 limbs. And typically when people, because I teach different teacher trainings, sometimes some groups think of Yama as how you relate to the external world. But the word Yama itself means restraint or control. So it's not just how you relate to the external world, but also to yourself. So part of Ahimsa, Himsa is violence. And whenever in Sanskrit we add the word A to it, we're negating. So Ahimsa means non-violence. Satya is truth, asatya means non-truth. So ahimsa is such a foundational and the first yama, the first restraint, because there is this impulse when we are in survival mode or when we want something, the impulse is to get things at any cost for the purpose of survival. So Patanjali, and of course all the masters, Patanjali just codified it, but there were many, many masters and a rich history of yoga, over 10,000 years old. And they constantly remind us to come back to this principle of ahimsa and say how on a subtler and subtler level we can refine our thoughts, our words, our actions, how we relate to other human beings, and also how we relate to ourselves. So our self-talk. So that's, I think when I was younger, it helped me understand my own self-talk towards myself. What am I telling myself? Is it in line with ahimsa, or, is there a lot of himsa? Just because somebody had a judgmental or condemning kind of idea about me, am I identifying it with it that strongly that it becomes me? So all these nuances, I think I feel really blessed that my grandfather was there as my first guru, helping me understand that process of not just thoughts, but also emotions, how emotions, when repressed, can impact me. There were many things as a kid. I had dysfunctionalities where, let's say, I'll give you an example. I've shared it with people in the teacher training, where I was a bedwetter, and there was a lot of shame around bedwetting at 10. And my grandfather was one who actually freed me of it, or cured me of it, or healed me, whatever word we want to use, just by sharing his own experience, and said 10 is nothing. I was a bedwetter till 16, 17, and this is related to fear of the father, the masculine, and that deep-rooted fear, when unprocessed, you're going to do that. There's going to be lack of control. So for me, cognitively understanding it and also having the practices, the yogic practices, actually helped me heal it. And this fear is also, when we hold in fear, that is also great himsa or great violence to the nervous system and to the body. So I have so many instances like that with my grandfather, with my gurus, and I feel eternally grateful for that guidance to say, why am I holding in the violence that somebody else is throwing at me? And therefore, I need to process these emotions. And Farah, you brought up another point, a beautiful point, where the internalization is not just from family, but all of media. It's like we're exposed to so much of violence. And my grandfather never let us watch. I mean, even when I was growing up, there weren't many channels. So, but he never let us watch too much TV. And he'll say, oh, that's going to influence your mind, because he was a scientist and a yogi at heart. So he never let, I mean, we watched Ramayana and we watched Cosmos by Carl Sagan. Those were the two programs. A little bit of rationed, uh, Tamil movies or a little bit of Hindi movies. And now I see the wisdom behind it, where he said, no, that's going to go into your unconscious, and that's without you knowing, that's how you're going to relate to yourself and to the world. So there's a great science in also understanding what we expose ourselves to or what we eat. What we eat need not be just the food. It's everything we absorb through the senses is what we eat. And we have to be really, really careful, what we take in through the senses. That is also ahara, or that is also the food we imbibe through the senses, and be mindful of not taking in violence through the senses.
Thank you both for those reflections. We've already gotten into this question in part for sure, which is different forms of violence, because on the surface, Himsa or nonviolence, most people might just think about physical harm or physical violence. But physical violence is really just the most extreme expression of violence, isn't it? So I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit about the roots of violence within ourselves and how we can work with those in order to avoid getting to more extreme cases where it might spill over into physical violence or even just shouting, that sort of violence. Do each of you have some thoughts around that, Farah?
Just saying, picking up on something that the example you gave, Maitreyi, of how repressing emotions is a violence to ourselves. We don't have a lot of tools in our culture to really understand how to face the emotions that arise with us, what tools we can use. And certainly we don't have a lot of good examples in our culture of also skillful expression of emotions, you know, and how to bring emotional content into conversations with people, because often emotions are arising in context of relationships. So, you know, um, I think understanding, one of my favorite books on communication is written by Thich Nhat Hanh. It's called The Art of Communicating. And the first chapter is all about coming home to yourself.
Mhm.
The foundation of communication with everyone else in our world must start with learning to communicate with ourselves. And that means developing a relationship with your breath and understanding how thoughts and emotions impact breath and heartbeat. That develops an understanding of a relationship with our bodies and knowing what happens physiologically and somatically when certain emotions arise. And that also involves developing some tools so that when strong and difficult things arise, we can, one thing that I often do when strong emotions arise is I co-regulate with nature. I
Mm.
put myself in relationship to a larger living organism that has a balancing and harmonizing effect on my physiology. And I can't tell you how many times it has, it works 100% of the time in bringing me back into balance. And with anger, your brain is kind of hijacked and it narrows. Not only do our eyes, our focus and our vision narrows, but our brain narrows. And when I co-regulate with nature, what happens is I'm able to have a much better perspective of what's arising within me and I have clarity on what the actual challenge is. And in that broader space, then I am more likely to choose skillful ways.
Mhm.
And I like the term conflict engagement rather than resolution, because conflict engagement implies a process rather than an outcome. And I think that's often also one of the problems that is embedded in how we think about challenges that come up in relationship, is we have an emotion and then we get attached to maybe an outcome that we want to see, rather than necessarily entering an unknowable safe space with another person where neither knows where you're going to go and what the outcome is. But that space, when two people engage in that space where you don't know the outcome, it is so full of potentiality and so fruitful. And two people can experience subtle and deep shifts in engaging in that unknowable space.
Thanks, Farah. That's beautiful. Yeah, just to be open to the mystery of things. That is really important. So coming back to Ross's question of the subtleties of it, where it's not physical violence, if I remember right. So the first principle, at least in yogic practice, is self-observation. So I find that before, and that to do it in a compassionate way. And I find that skill is missing in a lot of people, but because there's no connectivity or there's no relationship to self, what happens is everything, before you know it, the reaction escalates, and then there's conflict, and there's another escalation, and it blows up. So I mean, in the practice, we start off with Karuna Sakshi Bhava. Karuna is actionable compassion, and Sakshi Bhava is witnessing. So the more a person learns or practices to witness, they develop the capacity to be with things rather than having to constantly react. So my gurus used to say, oh, the ability to respond is responsibility. The ability to respond rather than to constantly be in reactivity. So I love that because it helps me also see a situation and say, okay, how best can I respond? How best can I be in the mystery of what's going to unfold? So in a step-by-step way, I love yoga because of the fact that it's given me a framework of multidimensionality, where it's not just thoughts or it's just not the body. And somehow I find in the Western way of looking at it is quite limited. So for me, because at a young age, I was exposed to the Panchakosha framework, I was like, okay, so what do we observe? We observe the physical body. How am I sitting? Am I keeping a reasonably healthy posture where there's no himsa to the body because I'm slouching or, in a twisted way where I'm causing harm to the body? And because I'm tuned into the body, I also am aware of my baseline of how things are. And let's say my breath shifts and I'm a little agitated or I'm contracting as somebody speaks, then I'm able to observe all these shifts in my physical body and say, okay, this is how somebody's energy or my own thought process is impacting my physical body. Maybe I'm contracting, and then I know, oh, okay, it's impacting me in a way which is self-protective and fearful, and it can, escalate at any time to anger. The way I deal with fear can be either anger or withdrawal, or depends on, each person's patterns. And then the second, is the pranamaya kosha and the breath as well. So we're constantly observing the breath and saying, okay, how is the breath shifting? How is the prana or energy shifting? In the manomaya kosha, when we're tapped in, what are our thought patterns, our belief systems? And of course, the vijnanamaya kosha and the anandamaya kosha, which are the cosmic fields as well. So for me, that framework of the 5 bodies allows me to say, okay, I have to be cognizant, tuned in, and constantly apply Karuna Sakshi Bhava, Karuna again, compassionate witnessing, to all these personal bodies first. First, the 3 personal bodies. That's the body, breath, emotions, energy, and the mind complex. And that was very useful for me to get subtler and subtler with the self-observation, and also being able to catch things before they blow up. And yeah, like a game of, I mean, cricket is very famous in India. So like a game of cricket, the more we practice, the better we get at the game. So I found that in my life, I'm like, oh, okay, as I practice it, my reactivity reduces. And sometimes the opposite also happens, where if I've spiritually bypassed something in the name of, oh, I have to be really nice, that also shifts with this Karuna Sakshi Bhava, where I'm able to be a bit more firm with expressing my needs. So I found both have happened because of the practice.
That's a really good point, the need for assertiveness and healthy boundaries when it comes to nonviolence. And maybe Farah, you're a practitioner of nonviolent communication, NVC. Can you explain a bit of the essence of this work and how you integrate it with yogic and Buddhist philosophy? And also as a secondary question, what does NVC say about assertiveness and boundaries in our communications?
So the first, I think even before I answer those questions, I think what I notice when I'm in teaching environments with this topic is that a lot of people don't really understand the difference between assertiveness and aggression. So it's
Mhm.
really important to be clear on what assertiveness and what aggression is. And, assertiveness might be you expressing what's going on for you. Aggression is when that expression harms another person. So just communicating what's happening within you isn't necessarily aggressive, though a lot of people think that they have to be aggressive in order to express themselves. And there's a lot of discernments that need to happen. In order to be assertive, and the foundation of assertiveness is self-esteem. It's valuing yourself, your time, your capacities, your energy, your your physical body. It's valuing yourself as much as you value others. So when we value ourselves, then then um, telling someone that what they're asking doesn't work for you is not aggressive. It may involve a sense of strength and an intensity that we might not be used to. I find in spiritual circles or spiritual communities, because we really emphasize the things like compassion and the truth of interbeing and interconnectedness, there's a high degree of permeability in our ability to experience and empathize with what other people are going through. Sometimes with assertiveness, you need a strong sense of solidity in yourself. And some people aren't used to inhabiting that space of really feeling solid and steady in yourself, using your voice in a very precise, measured, clear, direct way. So
Mhm.
sometimes it takes a little bit of time for people to develop the confidence to feel to harness their inner power, maybe even to harness emotions like anger and find a way that it can have a protective, positive quality. Um, so that's the first thing around the difference between assertiveness and aggression. How does NVC play into this nonviolent communication? What I love about nonviolent communication is the first step, and I think if everyone was able to just get the first step, we'd all have different conversations. Often how we think is in terms of duality and judgment, and it happens so quick without us even understanding that that's how things are framed in our psyche. So when you develop this ability to be self-aware, you can see a situation and take it out of a judgment and into an observation. And already when you do that, it changes everything. It changes everything. So often what I find in conflict is judgment, shame, and blame are often the predominant qualities of a conflict. So once you take it out of that realm and into the realm of observation, then already there's a mind shift and already there's an opening, and there's no projection. When there's no blame and no judgment, there's no projection. And when there's no shame, there's no internalization. It's framed differently, which, in mediation, we often learn that seeing multiple perspectives, multiple perspective taking is a brain development stage, that you can see how even contradictory truths can coexist. So, and the reason I find it really useful to integrate wisdom from Buddhism and wisdom from yoga lineages, those traditions have a perspective of ourselves that is much more holistic than what I think NVC originally, when it came out, really had. It has a perspective that we are more than a body. It has a perspective that conflict doesn't just exist in language and words. It exists energetically. It exists somatically. So I think those additional lineages really enhance the way that we can engage with those tools, so that when we are, it's possible. I've seen it in myself and I've seen it in others. It's possible to know NVC language, but still create harm in expecting and demanding that other people use the language that we want them to use. And it's possible to use maybe crude language, but come from a spirit of openness. So some of those formulaic tools, I think, can be a trap unless we offer multi perspectives that really open up our ability to see that yeah.
That's a wonderful point. Yeah, the spirit of openness. Maitreyi, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, no, that's beautiful, because to see the parallels, with the yogic tradition, where when we apply Karuna Sakshi Bhava, Karuna again, actionable compassion, and Sakshi Bhava, this emotion or attitude of witnessing, uh, the yogic dictum or ethos, which was popularized by J. Krishnamurti, is that how do you observe? You observe without condemnation or judgment. You observe without identification, and you observe without justification. Because the mind tends to go into these loops. If you see something, oh, this is terrible, blah, 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 before you know, there's that whole story. Or it's identification. I was born like this. My family is like this. I inherited this from my father, and this is how I'm going to be. This is how I'm going to die. Maybe you find a lot of older people talking like that, in India at least. And we're like, oh my God, that uncle, It's like this very, very strong identification, either with a pattern or a behavior or an emotional reaction. And then we also have justification. I'm like this because of this and because of that. And before you know it, we're wrapped again in another story. So for me, those three, I would say, foundational ways of self-observation or other observation really helped to kind of see that we need to observe without condemnation, without justification, and without identification. So there's, I think, those parallels between NVC and yoga, very clearly there. And the shame and blame as well in the teacher training. I'm constantly, repeating those principles as well of not having, this sort of shame and blame, which again the mind goes into, which is also yogic and a Buddhist, principle. So it's great that I don't know how old NVC is, but it's adapted a lot of these, kind of principles in a very Western context for people to easily assimilate. So it's nice to see that.
And I'll add, one thing that I felt was missing in NVC because it has different steps, but one thing I felt was missing is dialogue. So one thing that I learned when I studied conflict resolution is the art of asking open-ended questions. And because conflict arises in relationship, often people have this idea that, okay, you have an emotion that comes up, you develop self-awareness, you decide you want to express yourself. But at the end of the day, we don't want it to be a monologue.
Mm-hmm.
It's two people. So some way of not only expressing yourself skillfully to give information to the other person that they understand you better, but this missing piece, which is how do I engage the other person? What's going on for them? How can I ask a question that will give me better understanding? So it's it's paying attention to what's happening inside us, paying attention to also what's happening between us,
Mm-hmm.
paying attention to the body cues, because often there's so much more that's revealed through voice and tone than is communicated by words. And we know this because often we ask someone, "Oh, what's wrong?" Nothing, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So being attentive to being able to pay attention not only to what's happening inside of ourselves, what are we hearing that's being communicated not through words, but through voice, through body language, through engagement? Some people, um, their way of self-protection is to avoid, is to withdraw. So paying attention to those cues. In conflict resolution, we have the skill of transparency or immediacy. So bringing them forth into the conversation, like I, I noticed that when I said that, you kind of reacted, what's going on for you? And it's those kinds of open-ended questions that engage two people.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't tell you, just learning that skill of asking questions has enhanced my capacities as a human being in relationship in so many ways. And it's such a simple skill. So I wanted to bring that in as well, because I think that's something that hasn't come from the Buddhist lineage or yoga lineage, but comes specifically from conflict resolution as a way to engage
Mm.
and move from monologuing to dialoguing.
No, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. Yeah, because in yoga also there is the principle of vichara or inquiry. We start with Atma Vichara and self-inquiry, but you're also inquiring about life, you're inquiring about the other in a compassionate way. And when there is that curiosity and compassion, there is a safe landing space for the other as well. And our energy also, as Patanjali beautifully says, when we practice ahimsa and we're stable in the energy of ahimsa, we can also influence another through our pranic field. or pranamaya kosha. So that principle of inquiry and compassionate inquiry will allow for the other person also to open up or not. Maybe, it's, we have to be open to that possibility as well. And as you rightly said, the tone of voice and all of that. So a lot of communication, experts say that's only 7% of what you say. The rest is all body language, and so the rishis also spoke to that, or the yogis also spoke to that. I like to call the yogis or the rishis the ancient researchers, and that's why they gave us so many asana, where they said, oh, if you want to change something in your brain, then change the way you sit taller, sit a bit more confident. If you want to shift something about your emotions, then breathe deeper, and you have access to all those suppressed emotions just by using the breath to go into those areas of contractions or clenching or holding patterns that are there. And for me, that's been invaluable coming from the yogic tradition, where I'm like, yeah, what I'm saying is only a minuscule, amount of communication. There's all these other areas, and energetic, of course, just what is the energy? Even if I didn't open my mouth and say a word, what is the energy I'm exuding? And what is my circle of influence? So I think those are all really invaluable tools, which for me have come from the yogic tradition, because I've been immersed in that. Now, of course, I see a lot of parallels with the Western, stuff, which is great. Like I said, it's very accessible to people. We were talking about assertiveness and aggression. So we have a practice called the Vibhaga Pranayama, sectional breathing, where we work on the lower segment and we work on the lower three chakras. And then the more in touch we are, the more assertive we are. The more shaky we are, we veer towards either. We either become a doormat or we become aggressive, because we're not rooted. So for me, it's like, oh, okay, just by doing that practice, I can cultivate or evoke these qualities, not just invoke these qualities, but evoke these qualities from within me on every level: somatic, energetic, emotional, and mental. So yeah, so it's nice to see what NBC brings as well. Yeah.
I
A
wanted
lot
to
of
jump a
synergy.
little. Oh, sorry, Farah, did you have
No, a lot of
another?
synergy in
Yeah,
the,
yeah.
yeah.
I wanted to jump a little bit because something I wanted to make sure we didn't neglect was um, people's placement, environmental, sociological, cultural, the kind of environment that you're born into. If you're born into a war zone, all these different experiences that people have. And I think it's a lot easier for someone like me to sit and be philosophical about nonviolence or nonviolent communication. When I'm, the most I might get challenged is sort of an interpersonal, relational, or family conflict over a principle or a boundary or something like that. But I'm not facing real sort of structural and environmental violence around me all the time. What can we say? How can we speak to people that might find themselves in those kinds of environments? How does NVC or yoga or Buddhism support people in those much more extreme conditions?
I'm glad you brought this up, because um, NVC is not intended for situations of harm, abuse, exploitation, war, situations where there is physical harm, where there is exploitative use of the body. Um, it's not meant for those situations. There are other important ways to intervene to prevent harm from being done that I think are more appropriate. So it's absolutely has a place, and it has a place where it's absolutely not appropriate. And that's so fundamental to understanding um, that if somebody is listening to this and is in a situation where they're experiencing harm, that NVC is not the right strategy to use. Um, the right the most helpful thing would be to reach out to someone who might be able to support you and recommend the right intervention. And that might involve third-party interventions. So most important is for people to know to seek support. Because I'm not in those circumstances, and usually the students that I teach, usually where that comes into play is where people might have had adverse childhood experiences, and there might be a trauma memory from early childhood or adult experiences, and those traumas memories still live in the body, and those responses are activated in context of present relationships. That's often what I see in the context in which I teach. In that case, I think it's very, what I draw upon for wisdom in these areas is understanding the polyvagal ladder, and the fact of understanding what happens in a trauma response is sometimes a dorsal collapse. And you can't go from a dorsal collapse of feeling hopeless to forgiving someone. It doesn't happen. You can't jump from one to the other. There is a climbing up of the ladder of an activation and mobilization and stabilization of the nervous system. And it happens in a very sequential way. And so understanding that, I think, is important for people who have experienced situations of abuse in the past and might be in relationships where they're noticing exaggerated response, or a trauma response is playing into their current life. And so I'll just stop there, because I think I've given you enough of where it doesn't work, and the kinds of contexts that I think we do see situations of people's background coming forward in this kind of work. But I'd love to hear also what Maitreyi has to say.
Thanks, Farah. Yeah, and that's a great question, Ross, because yoga and I would say, the Indian ethos, and the stories, the Mahabharata, Ramayana, there's so many Puranas where every situation has been addressed, even war, like the whole Bhagavad Gita happens at Kurukshetra. It's basically, in a battlefield. And the first chapter is Vishadha Yoga. I mean, Arjuna is not doing a yoga practice as we understand it today in a yoga studio, but Vishadha means depression or dejection, and that is the yoga. So you may ask, like, how can a depression or a dejection become a yoga? Because it offered him the opportunity for union, where Krishna could come in. He was not arrogant about knowing this is what I'm pretty clear I want to be doing this. He actually breaks down in the battlefield and said, is it even worth it where I have to fight my cousins? And if you see the history, the Kauravas and the Pandavas, there are 5 Pandavas. This is for people who don't know the context of the Bhagavad Gita. So there are 5 reasonably good Pandavas, and I mean, I'm oversimplifying, and 100 of their cousins who are the bad Kauravas, And so Arjuna is one of the reasonably good Pandavas who has to stand up to his cousins who've used, all sorts of trickery, and they've cheated, and they've usurped the kingdom of the Pandavas. And they're basically people who are not fit to rule a kingdom. And yet, because of the relational factor that they're cousins, and Arjuna has to fight not just his cousins, but his teachers and people he knows and he has an emotional attachment to, the dejection and the depression of having to do that, he frames it in a way where he thinks, oh, why am I doing this just for a piece of land? Why am I doing this for a kingdom? And Krishna, who is again an avatar of the divine, reframes it for him and says, no, this is your dharma, this is your duty, where you have to bring in harmony by not allowing somebody who does not have the qualities of a ruler to rule that land. It's as simple as that. That you have to stand up for what is right, and being a warrior, that is your duty to stand up for what is right. So Krishna is actually moving him towards fighting the war when Arjuna was, ready to not fight. And from the outside, it might look like Arjuna is, practicing nonviolence. And Krishna is actually telling him to be violent. And that's why it's, the situational ethics is quite tricky if we don't know the entire context of what's going on, and saying in a particular, let's say, a war zone, you may have to defend your land, defend your people, defend your wife, defend your kids. And in that situation, if you're using violence to stop violence, it's perfectly valid, is what we learn from the Bhagavad Gita, to protect, where you're not using anything excessive and you don't have a vendetta, but it's perfectly valid to protect what is dear to you and also stand up for what is right. So yes, those are all great questions, which, different Puranas or different stories have answered in the yogic context, or in the many, 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 many stories that are there. Like there are umpteen stories like that in the Indian context, I would say. But yeah, for the most part, like Farah, I don't teach people from war zones. I teach people who have trauma in the body, and therefore it is limited to that context. In India, of course, I used to work with a lot of kids and their mothers sometimes, who lived in the slums, who there was a lot of violence, physical violence as well. And in those cases, the right thing to do was, in many cases, to go and, place a police complaint or fight against it. And, so then we're not trying to use nonviolent communication in that, context, as Parag was rightly saying. You do what is appropriate, again, without a vendetta. You're saying, I'm going to protect this person. And some people, the language they listen to, the men, the language they listen to is a language of power, not the language of sweetness. So you have to speak in a way that they understand, which means a policeman comes and warns them and says, hey, don't beat your wife. Otherwise, I'm going to take you to the police station and beat you. And then the beatings will stop, So it's, yeah, as sad as it sounds, that's the language that a lot of people, understand, which is, and we've done a lot of that with the women there. The work is, of course, they also separate from that and they learn better boundaries. But it's quite enmeshed in India, what will society say? What will, how my daughter is not going to get married if I leave my husband. So there's so many enmeshments which are quite sad in that kind of a context, and so many nuances and so many things we have to look into. So it's quite nuanced in what situation we're approaching. So thanks for that question, Ross. Yeah.
Maybe we can close just talking a little bit about love. Um, Farah has a beautiful quote, as does Maitreyi, about love, and I'll share a snippet from each of them. Farah, in a blog post you had written for Hollyhock called "How Do You Stay Hopeful?" You wrote, "Love, specifically self-love, and love and respect for the dignity of others, is the foundation of conflict resolution, nonviolent communication, and Eastern wisdom traditions. When we love ourselves, we hold space for all emotions, inquire deeply into the roots, and understand our freedom to choose and cultivate wholesome attitudes and right perception. We learn ways of speaking our truth and expressing our vulnerabilities in ways that don't project shame, blame, or illusionary mental narratives." Maitreyi wrote, and it's much shorter, "Love is presence and a deep commitment to one's own expansion and the expansion of others." First, Farah, I'm wondering if you could just comment on this principle of love and its importance in how we deal with difficult emotions, the roots of violence, and how we relate to others in challenging circumstances.
I'll ask Maitreyi to answer this first. I'd like a little bit of time to think about how to answer this one.
Sure, yeah.
Thanks, Farah. So coming to the question of love and processing, I'm going back a little bit where we were talking of projections and processing and creating this expansiveness. By expansiveness, I mean having this safe space where we can inquire compassionately into what is going on. And Farah spoke to the principle of this nervous system. So when our nervous system feels safe, and that's what yoga does for us, when we move in ways that are non-violent, then we create safety in the body because we're either pushing or we're collapsing. There's again, those two extremes. Rather than saying, I'm going to move in ways that feel safe for my body, I'm going to breathe in ways that feel expansive, where I can release the contractions. I'm going to use my prana. In Tantra, we do a lot of pranic practices where I can become reconnected to prana nadis. So there are about 72,000 prana nadis. And through that, we also connect to our nervous system, and we're creating cohesive flows. And these flows can be blocked again due to violence, either violence from the past or present, or we say samskaras from lifetimes. We go all the way in yoga to not just this lifetime and what harm was caused. So all of these, I would say, are a way of self-love. I'm just looping it back to this question of love, saying when we allow the space for safety through the yogic practices, that is through the somatics, through the energetics, through the emotional inquiry, and accepting, acknowledging, refining, and releasing these emotions, understanding these emotions as a messenger without condemning or blaming them, then that is love, that presence. That's why I said love is presence. And we have this principle of either investing and committing to our own evolution by consistently keeping that safe space. So our sadhana is not just that safe space on the mat, but even during the day. Am I overscheduling my day? Because I've done that many, many times when I was younger, even though I was teaching yoga. I was, because I come from an Indian ethos where Ross knows. He's like, how do you do all this? And I'm like, that's how, I was trained. And it was a lot of himsa to myself because, this need to get it all done rather than saying, I'm going to savor things. I'm going to be with it. And if I do less, that's how it's going to be. But we have to take the risk. And that risk is or can seem scary in the beginning because we're always taught to achieve more and do more. So this capacity to create rhythm of safety, not just on the mat, but also off the mat, is the foundation for love. So, and that requires presence. And as we sit with that presence, our body and our being expands. And therefore, it is a commitment and consistency towards our own expansiveness or expansion and creating that same space for another. That to me is love. Yeah. So I'll just circle it back there.
I think if I were to write that answer again to the question, it would be captured in one word, and that is acceptance. Acceptance of ourselves, which is not to say we don't aspire to grow and expand, but we accept as we are right now in all its messy imperfection. Acceptance of other people as they are. That's really love. When you can accept people as they are, I can't think, like that's a profound kind of love, which is not to say that other people also, just because we accept them doesn't mean we're also inviting them to grow, evolve, expand. They can coexist. Acceptance isn't fixed. It's just the foundation from which we accept ourselves and we accept others. I would also add, because I completed a difficult chapter in my life, and it took me months, months of resisting before I could accept. And when I was able to accept the hardship and realities and difficulties that were part of my life at that time, I really felt it open the door to grace. And it opened the door to a benevolent support that is always available to me, but is available to me when I don't resist energetically and psychologically. So for me, at this moment in my life, when I think of love, I really think of acceptance.
Folks, we've been having a wonderful conversation on nonviolence with Arkaya founder Yogacharini Maitreyi and our honored guest and friend Farah Nazrali. Big thanks to both of you. I really enjoyed that, and I'm going to take some time to integrate all the insights. Um, Thank you so much.
It's been such a pleasure. I hope we can do it again. And it's been so delightful to be in conversation with you, Maitreyi.
It's been beautiful. Thanks, Farah. And thanks, Ross, for being such a wonderful facilitator as well. He's seasoned podcast host. So
Yeah, great questions to really bring all
yes,
of this forward. Thank you.
it's been wonderful having you, Farah. And knowing you when I first came to Vancouver, maybe I'll just mention this. Farah actually interviewed me on her Drishti point, and it was so lovely to hear that interview after, was it 15 years or six? I don't remember. It was such a long time ago. So thank you for all the wonderful work you did as well, and you continue doing.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thank you.